I ended my last devlog asking the question, should I continue developing my relaxing little game where you design terrariums? And after a week of opening Unity and standing looking out the window menacingly and searching for an answer, I've kinda got an answer. The answer's maybe. What I'm trying to find an answer to now is, what does the finished game actually look like? There's plenty of games out there like Tiny Terrarium, you've got Islanders, Dwarf Romantic, Tiny Glade. I would even count games like House Flipper and those games where you design aquariums. So in order to fully commit to this project, I sort of need to figure out where I want it to go. And I'm still kind of trying to figure that out. But in the meantime, there was some glaring issues and feedback that I got from the game jam, which I really wanted to resolve regardless of my commitment to the project. So this has been my week of working on Tiny Terrarium. So Alex here highlighted that it would be good if we could change up the skybox colour and make some night scenes. So Alex, I agree with you. So what I did was I added another menu option for changing the skybox. I just added a simple rule to my button script so that now we can change the material of the skybox when we click on one of the options. Alex is on a roll here because he or she also mentioned that turning off the UI so we can get some really nice screenshots of the terrariums would be a good idea. And again, I agree. So I added a pretty simple approach here, which is just a method for either setting the canvas to active or inactive. That gives us that nice wee effect. Next thing, I noticed quite a few people in the comments were getting frustrated with placing objects, and when I went in and had a little play around, so was I, funnily enough. What would happen basically is when you were using the buttons, occasionally your terrarium would turn into a bit of a tornado. Apparently the controls for spinning the terrarium around were maybe a wee bit too sensitive. So what I did here was added another very simple bit of code which checks when you click and drag to spin the terrarium. It will check if you're interacting with a UI element first. If you are, then it will return before it does any of the rotation code. And this basically just means that we can now press the buttons without the fear of the terrarium going for a spin by itself. Now here's a big one. All the terrariums were flat, and I wasn't really big on that. The whole point should be to create like interesting shapes and landscapes. So how should I go about doing this? Well, I mean, Unity terrains seemed like the way to go. I've never used them before, so now's really the best time to jump straight in. I added a terrain and I started messing about with the controls, but there's a problem. It's square or rectangular, and my terrarium is supposed to be like a round jar, so I need it to be circular. So I went, started googling some pretty dumb shit, and I couldn't get an answer. So I went and asked Claude AI for advice, and he told me to use a shader, which was quite an interesting thought. So I made this shader which hides the corners of the terrarium, and then there we go, now it's round. But now it doesn't really look like a jar, it's just like flat on the bottom. And I couldn't find a decent answer to this, so I went back to the drawing board. Now my next plan was to render my own shapes in a script, and this is the result of that. And that looks like a jar. So now I just need some script for manipulating the vertices so we can get that nice sort of landscape effect. So my plan for this was to have the players like paint hills and valleys using the mouse by clicking and dragging. So I just got to work on simply, first of all, having a key that I would press which would alter the vertices before I went crazy and added any mouse controls. And I won't lie, I couldn't get it to work. Now I know you might be watching this, and you might be a 3D pro, and you might know exactly what I should have done here. So if you do, put your suggestion in the comments, because I would love to figure this out, and I'm going to have to come back to it at some point if I carry on with this project. Now, I didn't want to scrap this feature, but I was racking up so much time on this terrain task. So, embarrassingly, I took the most cheap and cheerful solution imaginable. I opened up Blender, I modelled some hills, and I added them as another object that this player can just simply place. Yeah, I really went there, but I thought it was an important sort of stylistic feature to add to the game, and sometimes the solution can't be perfect straight away. The glaring problem with this, obviously, is that other objects will clip through the hills, so my next plan, if I carry on with this game, is to add raycasting onto the hills, meaning that you could stack like rocks and trees on top of them. So with that done, we've now got some hills, and we can also use the same material as the base of the terrarium, just to make it all add up together. Now in the true spirit of all things game dev, adding those features somehow resulted in a very irritating bug. The rotations of placing the objects were resetting each time that they were placed, so basically when you rotated an object, it was doing nothing, because it would just reset it anyway. So I spent probably about 40 minutes going through all my code, to then realise I had accidentally deleted one line of code that was responsible for handling this. So after I added that line back in, another bug somehow appeared. It was apparent that if you rotated the terrarium, then you went to place an object, the cursor position wasn't accurate. This is basically because my code is rendering a plane on top of the terrarium, which I then raycast onto to find where to place objects. The problem is in my setup. You see, this isn't the first time I've had an issue in this department. I've got a base object which contains the full terrarium. I've then got the actual physical base of the terrarium, the 3D object that you can see, and then I've got another container inside of that which holds all the objects the player puts into the terrarium. The problem is with this hierarchy, when I'm accessing and I'm altering different transform properties, I have to factor in the hierarchy of this whole setup. So, like a proper game dev, I solved the rotation bug by just removing the ability for players to rotate the terrarium. The problem's solved, but here's how I did it. Instead of now rotating the terrarium, when the player clicks and drags, it rotates the camera around the terrarium, and this works like a charm. It's the same effect and you wouldn't even notice the difference, but now objects are placed accurately regardless of the rotation of the terrarium. Okay, some final wee finishing touches that I added. I noticed that placing a lot of objects, like if you wanted to make it very grassy, it was quite a bit of a pain. You had to click and click and click. So I added a brush tool there where you can basically just click and drag and it places lots of grass. I noticed though that it was all looking a bit too samey because they would all be the same size, they would all have the same rotation. So I added in a randomize function, which means that each time you press or you click and drag to brush, it will randomize the size and it will randomize the rotation, and it just gives it a wee bit of flavour. And it also just means that it's easier to cover an area with like rocks and plants while keeping a bit of a natural look. You know, that very natural low poly look. And so yes, that's been this week in game development for me. That's what I've been working on. I'm still not really sure what I want to do with this game. I do want to keep working on it. I just don't know what it looks like. I don't know what the finished product looks like. If it's just one of those sort of goalless games like Tiny Glade where you just kind of let your creativity go mad, or if it's a bit like House Flipper where it's kind of mindless but there's still objectives left to do. I'm not sure. That's where I kind of want your advice. If you're watching this and you've got any ideas, or you look at that game and you see the building blocks of something you would like to play, let me know. I'd love to hear, and really appreciate you checking the video out. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on how the game should look, and who knows, might see you next week. Cheers guys.